Let us dispense with the pleasantries and the gauzy, soft-focus hagiography that so often suffocates the corpse of rock and roll history. We are not here to light a candle for the sainted Beatles, nor are we here to participate in the communal, baby boomer ritual of misty-eyed remembrance. That is the stuff of television specials and glossy magazine retrospectives designed to sell you a comfortable, sanitized version of the past. Our purpose is far more brutal, and therefore, far more honest. We are here to conduct an autopsy. We are here to examine an ending, not as a tragedy, but as a biological and artistic necessity. The performance given by the Beatles on the rooftop of their Apple Corps headquarters at 3 Savile Row, London, on January 30th, 1969, was not a concert. To call it such is to misunderstand its very essence. It was not a planned event. It was a spasm. It was a 42-minute act of public self-exorcism, a final, glorious, and profoundly necessary convulsion before the rigor mortis of dissolution finally set in. It was the last coherent thought of a dying organism. To truly comprehend the desperate brilliance of that freezing lunchtime, one must first be willing to descend into the abject misery, the soul-crushing boredom, and the simmering interpersonal poison of the weeks that preceded it. One must understand that the rooftop was not a stage. It was an escape hatch. The grand, ill-conceived project that led to this rooftop apotheosis was born of Paul McCartney's particularly potent brand of denial. By the winter of 1968, the entity known as the Beatles was, for all intents and purposes, already a memory. It had ceased to be a functioning, collaborative unit. The 4 men were now satellites orbiting a shared past, their trajectories increasingly divergent. The White Album, released just weeks earlier, was the perfect document of this disintegration, a collection of brilliant, but largely solo recordings packaged under a single, ironically blank banner. It was the work of 4 artists sharing a studio, not a band creating in unison. The magic, that inexplicable telepathy that had fueled their ascent, had evaporated, leaving behind a residue of resentment and professional obligation. Their manager, Brian Epstein, the man who had been their anchor, their arbiter, and their most ardent believer, was dead, and in the power vacuum he left, the delicate internal balance of the group had shattered. John Lennon, the band's founder and its cynical, abrasive soul, was creatively and personally adrift. He had found a new focus, a new collaborator, a new reason for being, in the avant-garde artist Yoko Ono. His devotion to her was absolute, and her constant, silent presence in the studio served as a passive, yet powerfully effective disruption to the established boys' club dynamic. More than that, Lennon was wrestling with the insidious fog of a heroin addiction, a habit that left him lethargic, creatively blocked, and prone to a withering, detached sarcasm that could kill an idea before it drew its first breath. George Harrison, long the quiet Beatle, was quiet no more. He was simmering with a righteous, long-suppressed fury. Having emerged from the long shadows of the Lennon-McCartney songwriting monolith as a composer of extraordinary depth and talent, he found his offerings, songs that would later be recognized as classics, treated with a galling condescension. He was tired of being patronized, tired of being instructed on how to play his instrument by McCartney, tired of fighting for a sliver of space on albums dominated by his bandmates. He was a man on the verge of artistic self-actualization, shackled to a partnership that refused to acknowledge his growth. And Ringo Starr, the stoic, professional heart of the band, was trapped in the middle, a bewildered observer watching the slow, painful divorce of the 3 men he considered his brothers. He had already quit the band once during the White Album sessions, driven away by the toxic atmosphere and the feeling that he was an unappreciated outsider. He was the emotional barometer of the group, and his weary expression during these days spoke volumes. Into this morass of dysfunction stepped McCartney, armed with a new project and a desperate, almost manic optimism. His idea, which he dubbed Get Back, was a fantasy rooted in a misremembered past. He envisioned the band returning to its roots, shedding the ornate studio artifice of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and the sprawling introspection of the White Album. They would become a simple 4-piece rock and roll band again, writing and rehearsing new material for a grand live performance, their first in over 2 years. This climatic event would be filmed for a television special and recorded for a live album. It was a noble concept, a producer's solution to an artist's problem, and it was doomed from the start. It was an attempt to impose a narrative of cheerful reunion onto a reality of bitter estrangement. The chosen location for this creative renaissance was a cavernous, soul-destroying soundstage at Twickenham Film Studios. It was a space devoid of warmth, atmosphere, or inspiration. The band, accustomed to the nocturnal womb-like comfort of Abbey Road Studios, was now forced into an uncomfortable diurnal routine, arriving in the cold, early mornings to work under the harsh, unflattering glare of film lights. Director Michael Lindsay Hogg's cameras were a constant, intrusive presence, capturing every sullen glance, every passive-aggressive jab, every long, agonizing silence. The footage from these sessions is a harrowing document of creative paralysis. We see McCartney, brimming with ideas, trying to direct and cajole his bandmates, but his enthusiasm is increasingly perceived as bossiness, his suggestions as dictates. We see Lennon, often mute and withdrawn with Yoko at his side, offering little more than sarcastic asides or half-hearted, mocking renditions of old rock and roll standards. We see Harrison, his frustration palpable, attempting to introduce intricate new compositions like All Things Must Pass, only to have them met with indifference or clumsy, dismissive interpretations. The infamous exchange where McCartney lectures a visibly irritated Harrison on how to play a guitar part is a microcosm of the entire wretched affair. It is not a collaboration, it is a power struggle, and it is excruciating to watch. The music, when it came at all, was often listless and uninspired. The magic was not just gone, it felt as if it had never existed. The project was supposed to be about the joy of playing together, but the overwhelming impression is one of profound, suffocating boredom. This was not the sound of a band getting back to where they once belonged. It was the sound of four men clocking in for a job they had come to despise. The breaking point arrived on January 10th, 1969. Following another particularly dismissive argument with McCartney over a guitar arrangement for the song Two of Us, George Harrison finally had enough. He calmly packed up his guitar, looked at his bandmates and said, "I'm leaving the band now, see you around the clubs." And with that, he walked out. The Get Back project, the grand live comeback, the entire fragile fantasy, had shattered. The Beatles, for the second time in 6 months, were a three-piece. The cameras, of course, kept rolling, capturing the stunned, awkward silence in his wake. A week of tense, off-camera negotiations ensued. Lennon, in a moment of either gallows humor or genuine consideration, suggested replacing Harrison with Eric Clapton, a move that would have been a final, unforgivable insult. But Harrison was eventually coaxed back, not by McCartney's pleas, but by a series of crucial concessions. Firstly, all talk of a grand public concert in some exotic location, a Roman amphitheater in Libya, and a cruise ship had been two of the more fanciful suggestions, was to be permanently abandoned. Secondly, they would scrap the cold, impersonal hell of Twickenham and relocate to the more intimate, if still deeply flawed, confines of their own headquarters. They would move the operation to the basement of Applecore at 3 Savile Row, where a new studio was being hastily and shoddily assembled by their resident electronic eccentric, the magic Alex Martis. But the most important condition, the one that would prove to be the project's salvation, was Harrison's insistence on bringing in an outside musician. He invited an old friend, the prodigiously talented American keyboardist Billy Preston, to sit in on the sessions. Preston, who the Beatles had known since their formative pre-fame days in Hamburg, was not just a virtuoso on the Hammond organ and the Fender Rhodes electric piano. He was a human catalyst. His arrival had an immediate transformative effect. He was not a Beatle. He carried none of the emotional baggage, the unspoken resentments, the years of complex history. He was simply a brilliant, cheerful, and professional musician, happy to be there and ready to play. In his presence, the four Beatles were forced to be on their best behavior. The sullen silences, the passive-aggressive sniping, the schoolboy squabbling, it all dissipated, replaced by a renewed sense of professionalism. They were no longer just four guys in a room. They were the Beatles with a guest. And they had to be good. Preston's effervescent, soulful keyboard work immediately enriched their sound, providing a new sonic texture that filled the gaps and glued the disparate parts together. The music suddenly had a warmth and a swing that had been entirely absent at Twickenham. On tracks like Get Back and Don't Let Me Down, his electric piano is not just an embellishment. It is an essential, life-giving organ. He was, as Lennon later admitted, the fifth Beatle for that brief period, and his presence single-handedly rescued the musical component of the Get Back sessions from utter failure. Yet, despite the vast improvement in atmosphere and musical output, one fundamental problem remained. Michael Lindsay Hogg still needed an ending for his film. The entire project had been predicated on documenting the creation of a live show, and there was still no show. The idea of a public concert had been vetoed. The days were ticking by, and the project was threatening to peter out with a whimper. The solution, when it finally emerged, was born not of grand artistic vision, but of a combination of logistical pragmatism, creative desperation, and a final flickering ember of the old, anarchic Beatles spirit. Who suggested it first is lost to the conflicting memories of the participants. Lennon, Starr, and Lindsay Hogg have all laid claim to the idea. But the logic was as simple as it was audacious. They needed a stage, and there was one, right above their heads. Their own roof. The idea was absurd, it was impulsive, unprofessional, and logistically nightmarish. It was a flagrant disruption of public order. A two-fingered salute to the stuffy, respectable traditions of their Savile Row neighbors, the bespoke tailors and private banks. It was, in other words, perfect. It was a solution that sidestepped all the issues that had plagued them for weeks. There would be no audience to intimidate them, no tickets to sell, no hype to live up to. It would be, in the purest sense, a return to their most basic origins. Just plug in and play, and to hell with the consequences. It was a profoundly Scouse idea, a piece of glorious, impulsive mischief. The decision was made with a collective shrug rather than a triumphant cheer. It was the only option left. On the morning of Thursday, January 30th, 1969, a bitterly cold and windy day, the plan was set in motion. A team of roadies and engineers, including a young tape operator named Alan Parsons, who would go on to engineer Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon, began the arduous task of hauling the band's heavy Selmer and Fender amplifiers, Ringo's drum kit, and a collection of microphones up the 5 narrow flights of stairs to the flat, lead-lined roof of the Georgian townhouse. Wooden planks were laid down to create a makeshift stage. Microphone cables were painstakingly run from the rooftop, down the side of the building, and in through a window of the basement studio, where engineer Glyn Johns was stationed at his 8-track recording console, tasked with capturing the performance for the album. The technical challenges were immense. There was no proper monitoring system, meaning the band would barely be able to hear themselves play. The wind was the biggest enemy, threatening to create a deafening roar on the vocal microphones. The ingenious last-minute solution was quintessentially lo-fi. Mal Evans, the band's hulking, devoted road manager, was sent to a nearby department store to buy women's pantyhose, which were then stretched over the microphones as makeshift windshields. It was a chaotic, ad hoc, and deeply unprofessional setup. It was rock and roll in its rawest form. Shortly after noon, the 4 Beatles, accompanied by a shivering Billy Preston, emerged from a rooftop access door and stepped onto the makeshift stage. They were not dressed for a rock concert. They were dressed for the brutal London cold. Lennon, looking every bit the eccentric rock star, had borrowed Yoko's thick fur coat. McCartney, ever the sharp-dressed man, wore a dark business suit. Harrison was clad in a magnificent shaggy black fur coat, while Starr, seeking protection from the damp and the wind that whipped across his exposed position, was wearing his wife Maureen's bright red plastic raincoat. They looked less like the most famous musicians on the planet, and more like a group of eccentrically dressed removal men. For a few moments, they milled about awkwardly, blowing on their hands, making final adjustments to their instruments. And then, with a nod from McCartney, they began to play. The first sound to cut through the lunchtime hum of central London was the unmistakable driving riff of Get Back. It was a declaration of intent, a ragged, powerful, and utterly electrifying statement. This was not the polished, overdubbed product the world had come to expect from the Beatles. This was raw, muscular, and alive. McCartney's voice, clear and strong, sliced through the cold air. His Hofner bass locked in a tight, funky groove with Starr's unshakable drumming. Lennon's rhythm guitar was chunky and aggressive, a world away from his lethargic noodling at Twickenham. And there, weaving through it all, was the warm, gospel-inflected soul of Preston's Fender Rhodes, the secret ingredient that made it all cohere. They ran through the song once, a little tentatively, a little rusty. Then they launched into it again, this time tighter, more confident, more alive. On the street below, 5 stories down, a scene of beautiful chaos began to unfold. Heads turned. Lunchtime strollers stopped in their tracks, looking up in bewilderment. The initial confusion, was it a record, a publicity stunt, quickly gave way to a dawning, incredulous wonder. Office windows in the surrounding buildings flew open, framing the faces of secretaries, accountants, and tailors. A crowd began to form on the pavement, spilling out into the street, bringing the Savile Row traffic to a standstill. For a few extraordinary minutes, the mundane, predictable rhythm of a London workday was shattered by an impossible, miraculous sound. The Beatles, the band that had retreated from the world into a mythical realm of studio wizardry, were back, and they were playing a free, unannounced concert for anyone lucky enough to be within earshot on their lunch break. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated communal joy. A spontaneous public event in an age before such things were manufactured for social media. Back on the roof, the band, energized by the audacity of their own actions, was hitting its stride. They launched into I've Got a Feeling, a song that was itself a perfect metaphor for the band's fractured state, a composite of 2 unfinished pieces. McCartney's section was a soaring, optimistic, full-throated rock anthem, a testament to his enduring belief in the power of love and positive thinking. It was then answered by Lennon's contribution, a weary, descending blues riff, and a stark, repetitive litany of a year gone horribly wrong. Everybody had a hard year. Everybody had a good time. Everybody had a wet dream. On that rooftop, sharing a microphone, their 2 opposing personalities, the optimist and the cynic, the idealist and the realist, were fused into a single, cohesive, and deeply moving whole. It was a moment of fleeting, unconscious unity, a dialogue that spoke volumes about their shared history and their divergent paths. Next came One After 909, a rockabilly throwback to their earliest days as teenage songwriters in Liverpool. It was a joyous, ramshackle performance, a nod to the innocent, leather-clad rockers they had once been, a brief, happy glance in the rearview mirror before the final plunge. Lennon's Dig a Pony followed, a piece of surrealistic, nonsensical psychedelia driven by a heavy, lurching riff. It was pure, unfiltered Lennon, and he delivered it with a snarling, committed passion. But the emotional core of the performance was his other contribution, Don't Let Me Down. This was not just a song, it was a raw, exposed nerve, a desperate, primal plea to Yoko Ono, his new anchor in a sea of confusion and disillusionment. On the rooftop, Lennon sang it with a throat-shredding intensity that bordered on anguish. It was the sound of a man screaming his dependencies into the void, a performance of shocking, uncomfortable, and utterly compelling vulnerability. They were loose, and gloriously so. They were not aiming for studio perfection. They made mistakes. At one point, Lennon, ever the jester, completely flubbed the lyrics to Don't Let Me Down, and instead of stopping, turned it into a moment of self-deprecating comedy, spouting a stream of inspired, nonsensical gibberish. The brief snippets of chatter captured between the songs are perhaps the most revealing part of the entire affair. We hear them laughing, complaining about the cold, and visibly enjoying the sheer, unadulterated thrill of what they were doing. My hands are getting too cold to play the chords, Lennon remarks at one point, not as a complaint but as a statement of fact, a shared experience. For the first time in weeks, perhaps months, they looked and sounded like a gang again. They looked and sounded like the Beatles. But the real world, in the form of the Metropolitan Police, was inevitably and politely closing in. The complaints had started to roll in, most notably from the stuffy, pinstriped management of the Royal Bank of Scotland, whose offices were adjacent to the Apple building. The traffic was snarled. The noise, for some, was not a miracle. It was an unacceptable disruption of the peace. 2 young, slightly intimidated police constables, PC Ray Shaler and PC Ray Dagg, were dispatched to investigate. They entered the Apple building and began to make their way to the roof. Inside, the Apple staff, in a final act of loyalty, did their best to stall them, engaging them in pointless arguments in the reception area. But the officers were politely insistent. They eventually made their way upstairs, emerging onto the roof to a sight that must have been utterly surreal. The Beatles, in full flight, playing to the sky. There was no dramatic confrontation, no throwing of tea chests, no rock and roll rebellion. This was England, after all. There was a series of polite, slightly awkward conversations. Mal Evans, whose job it was to protect the band from the outside world, tried to reason with them, to buy a little more time. The message from the constables was clear, if apologetically delivered. The show had to end. Knowing the end was nigh, the band decided to play one more song for the road. It was, fittingly, a final, blistering take of Get Back. Aware that this was almost certainly the last song they would ever perform together in public, they imbued it with a final, defiant energy. It was tighter, tougher, and more powerful than the earlier versions. As the song wound down, with the police looking on, McCartney, with a wry grin, ad-libbed a new line, directly referencing their precarious situation. "You've been playing on the roofs again and you know your mama doesn't like it. She's gonna have you arrested." The song crashed to a halt. The amplifiers were switched off, and the London silence rushed back in to fill the void. Then came the final, perfect epitaph. As the others began to pack up their instruments, John Lennon, the band's resident wit, and its most uncompromising truth-teller, stepped up to the microphone. With a look that was equal parts sincerity and pure, unadulterated sarcasm, he delivered the line that would become the performance's immortal closing statement, a perfectly pitched farewell for the greatest and most irreverent band in the world. "I'd like to say thank you on behalf of the group and ourselves, and I hope we've passed the audition." And with that, it was well and truly over. In the immediate aftermath, the Rooftop Concert was not hailed as the legendary event it is now considered. It was simply the end of a troubled and deeply unsatisfying project. The Get Back sessions limped to a conclusion. The mountain of tapes was handed over to engineer Glyn Johns, who attempted to compile them into a raw, warts and all live album, an approach that was repeatedly rejected by the band as being too ragged and unflattering. The tapes were shelved. The accompanying film sat in a vault. The Beatles, having stared into the abyss during January of 1969, managed to pull together one last magnificent time to create their true masterpiece and final recorded statement, Abbey Road. A year later, in 1970, with the band already officially and acrimoniously defunct, the Get Back tapes were handed to the American producer Phil Spector, who, to McCartney's eternal disgust, smothered the raw performances in his signature wall of sound, adding saccharine string arrangements and choirs. The resulting album, retitled Let It Be, was released as a posthumous, and for many, a deeply flawed tombstone. The accompanying film, cut by Lindsay Hogg to emphasize the arguments and the tension, served only to cement the public narrative of a miserable, bitter end. For decades, that was the story. The Rooftop Concert was seen as a brief, bright spot in a month of utter darkness, the final twitch of a dying band. But history is a fluid thing, constantly being reevaluated with the benefit of hindsight and new evidence. The release of Peter Jackson's monumental 2021 documentary series, Get Back, meticulously restored from over 60 hours of unseen footage, has forced a profound and necessary reappraisal of this entire period. Jackson's work stripped away the grim narrative of the original film and revealed a more complex and far more human truth. Yes, there was tension and argument, but there was also laughter, affection, and moments of breathtaking creative genius. The boredom of Twickenham was real, but the joy of creation at Apple was equally so. In this new, more nuanced context, the Rooftop Concert is no longer just a curious footnote or a sad farewell. It is the story's natural and triumphant climax. It is the culmination of the project's original, flawed premise. They did in the end get back. Not to the past, for that is impossible, but back to the very essence of what they were. A four-piece rock and roll band, playing live and loud. The performance was not a comeback, for they were already gone. It was a come-down, the final exhilarating rush before the long silence. It was the closing of a circle that had begun in the damp, sweaty cellars of Liverpool and the sordid nightclubs of Hamburg. For 42 glorious, freezing minutes, high above the oblivious city they had conquered, they were not a corporation, not a myth, not four estranged millionaires. They were a band. They climbed those stairs as fractured individuals, and for a few precious moments in the face of the wind and the law, they remembered how to be the Beatles. It was not the grand, polished ending they might have once imagined, but it was something far better. It was an ending that was raw, real, defiant, and entirely on their own terms. They did not fade away. They went out with a blast of pure, joyous noise that stopped the traffic, rattled the windows of the establishment, and gave one last, unrepeatable gift to the world. And yes, it is safe to say, they had most assuredly passed the audition.